I picked this image. It's a very old image. It's an image that portrays man being cast up on the beach by a whale. It's Jonah, a biblical figure. And in the story of Jonah, Jonah was out on a rough ocean storm, and he had been commanded by God to do something which he was ignoring. And the storm was sufficiently rough so that he got cast overboard. He was eaten by this giant. This is a whale as far as the medieval people were concerned. It's obviously not what we would think of as a whale, but they didn't know much about whales. Anyways, he was swallowed up by a whale and then cast back up on shore a number of days later. It's a death and rebirth story. And the reason I use it as an image is because it represents something of psychological import that you're all familiar with, but that you might not know that you're familiar with. Symbols are often like that. A symbol often stands for something that you know, but that you don't know that you know. There's lots of things that you know that you don't know that you know. Almost everything is like that, in fact. And it's rather obvious if you think about it, because if you were transparent to yourself and you knew everything you knew, you wouldn't have to study anything about psychology because you'd understand yourself completely. And we understand ourselves poorly. And so we have to study ourselves as individuals and then, you know, as phenomena in the world, as other people, and as mammals, and as animals, and as living things, and as political actors, and so on, just to get some minor notion of what's actually going on. And what that means in part is that you're more complicated than you can understand. And when you hear, say, psychoanalytic thinkers talking about ideas like the unconscious is actually a representation in some ways of the fact that there's far more to you than you know about. And what that means also is that there are different kinds of unconscious, and we certainly know that to be the case. There are different kinds of memory, for example. So a lot of your procedural knowledge is unconscious. And so your procedural knowledge is what allows you to do things like ride a bike, or walk for that matter, because you don't really know how you walk. It's actually a controlled fall, so you lean forward and then you use your legs to stop you from falling on the ground. It's encoded in your architecture rather than something that's apprehensible to your conscious understanding. Now, there are lots of phenomena that are procedural and unconscious, and then there are sort of borderline phenomena that you have some idea about that you can represent, but you still don't completely understand. So those sorts of representations tend to be more imagistic, and those are the sorts of things maybe that pop up in your fantasies and your dreams, and those are also the sorts of unconscious sources of knowledge that allow you to understand, say, complex works of literature or art that draw their meaning from multiple sources simultaneously and attempt to inform you at a deep level about how things are connected and how they're different. Now, this particular image is a journey to the underworld image, and that's a very, very old idea, a journey to the underworld. It's maybe the oldest myth. It's one of the oldest mythological ideas, or one of the oldest archetypal ideas. And the underworld it's a difficult phenomena to grasp. Although you certainly encountered the concept, particularly in movies. So for most of you, how many of you have seen all the Harry Potter movies? Right. So of course. And so in the second movie, I believe it's the second movie where Potter encounters a basilisk underneath Hogwarts. Is that right? Is that the second one? Yeah, well, that story is a journey to the underworld story. And the architectural setup of the movie, by architectural setup, I mean the relationship of Hogwarts, the castle, to the underground structures, is a symbolic representation of the representation of consciousness embedded in culture. And so that would be Potter and his friends embedded in the realm of magical knowledge, so to speak, that's outside of them. And that's represented by the castle, which is, you know, it's a representation of knowledge cast in stone. So that's a form of memory, to cast something in stone. And so Potter and his friends are being enculturated in this enclosed environment, in this safe enclosed environment. It's like a university. It's like the university more on the other side of the campus than on this side, for various reasons. Now underneath well, in the background, of course, in the Potter series, there's a battle between good and evil going on, and that's also an extremely old archetypal idea. I mean, that's an idea that's probably as old as human beings. And that's partly because human beings are very strange creatures, and they're capable of very, what would you call, profound acts of deception. And one of the things that separates human beings from most other animals is our capacity to use deception, and it's associated with our imaginativeness, right? Because we can imagine a variety of alternative potential realities and move towards them. That opens the door for us to deceive ourselves and others, because we can replace our accurate vision of the world, insofar as it's accurate, with whatever vision and representation we wish to choose. One of the things you find in childhood development, for example, is that the smarter the child, the earlier they learn to lie. And it's an offshoot of the ability to use fantasy. And so the idea of good versus evil comes out of that to some degree, because if you're dealing with people, you're always dealing with phenomena that can trick you in some way. They can represent reality as other than it is. And that's a tremendous problem for human beings, because it makes other people extremely difficult to figure out. Now, if you're honest and straightforward, then you're easy to figure out, because you don't have to be figured out. I can just take you at your word, which means you'll tell me something, and it'll be relatively straightforward, I'll be able to understand it, and then you'll go do it, no problem. I don't have to know anything about you. On the other hand, if you don't do things according to what you say you'll do, then you're a bottomless pit of incomprehensibility, and God only knows what you're going to be up to. And so that's an archetypal problem for human beings, and that's the problem of having to deal with the latent deceptive capacity of other people, and of course of ourselves. So that's all going on in the background of the Potter series. But underneath the castle, for example, remember what's under the castle in the second film? What is it? It's a basilisk, right? Yeah, and what happens when you look at a basilisk? Right, and so what might that mean? If you're thinking about it intelligently, say, what phenomena might that represent? What happens to prey animals when they encounter a predator? They freeze, exactly, yeah. So it's a representation of the fact that there are certain classes of phenomena that will freeze you on sight. And you freeze because there are parts of your brain that respond to phenomena in the external world as if you are prey. And the reason for that is, well, first you are, and second, from an evolutionary perspective, your ancestry, going back, say, tens of millions of years, is an ancestry that was composed of predecessors that were continually preyed upon. And we have entire systems in our brain that react to the class of potentially predatory events. Now, for human beings, that system has differentiated cognitively so that many of the things that we would experience as predatory threats in the modern world don't come in the shape of, say, crocodiles and bears and giant cats and so forth, the sorts of things that would necessarily prey on you in the night. But they're analogous in that the outcome is the same. You can be preyed upon by many things. You can be preyed upon by a corrupt corporation. And so it's perfectly reasonable to symbolize the actions of a corrupt corporation as a form of predation, and also to categorize that even more deeply as a reflection of the underlying consequences of the fact that people can deceive each other. Those sorts of representations get deep very, very rapidly. But they're active and living representations in that they still represent something that's profoundly true, which is not so much what things are in and of themselves, which is what science does, but what things are in relationship to you, which is more like what things mean. And things generally have a motivational or emotional meaning, and that meaning is generally quite tightly tied to the necessity that you have to survive and to thrive and to, to find someone to be with and to reproduce and all the Darwinian things that you're supposed to be up to. So a lot of these more archaic categories they're meaningful categories. They're categories of meaning. That's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it.